If you've been searching for a way to invest in SpaceX using Fidelity, you're probably already running into the same wall most people hit. You hear about SpaceX everywhere. Rockets landing themselves, Starlink satellites covering the planet, Mars missions being discussed like their next year's product launch, and naturally, you want a piece of it. So you open your Fidelity account, ready to buy shares, and then you realise something strange. You can't find SpaceX anywhere. And that's where most people get confused, because they assume every major company is automatically available on the stock market. But SpaceX is not a public company. It is still privately held, which means you cannot simply type it into Fidelity, click buy, and own shares like you would with Apple or Tesla. Not yet, at least. But that does not mean investing in SpaceX is impossible. It just means the process is indirect, more restricted, and in many cases reserved for specific types of investors. So in this video, we are going to walk through exactly how it works, what Fidelity can and cannot do for you, and the realistic paths people use to gain exposure to SpaceX in 2026. And by the end, you will understand not just the steps, but also the limitations that most beginners never hear explained clearly. Let's start with the most important truth. SpaceX is one of the most valuable private companies in the world. It has raised money from large institutional investors, venture capital firms, and select private equity participants. But because it is still private, its shares are not listed on any public exchange, like the NYSE or Nasdaq. That means Fidelity, as a brokerage, does not offer a direct buy button for SpaceX stock. So when people say invest in SpaceX through Fidelity, what they usually mean is one of three things. Either they are hoping Fidelity has some hidden access to private shares, or they are waiting for a future IPO, or they are looking for indirect exposure through funds or investment vehicles that may include private companies like SpaceX in their portfolio. Now let's break that down in a realistic way. The first and most straightforward path is waiting for a potential IPO. IPO stands for Initial Public Offering, and it is when a private company becomes publicly traded. If SpaceX ever decides to go public, Fidelity would almost certainly make it available, just like any other major stock. At that point, you would simply log into your Fidelity account, search for the ticker symbol, and invest directly. But here is the catch. SpaceX has not announced any confirmed timeline for an IPO. Elon Musk has repeatedly suggested that SpaceX prefers to stay private for longer because it allows more control over long-term projects like Starship and Mars colonization. There has been speculation about Starlink, which is SpaceX's satellite internet division, potentially going public before the main company, but again, nothing is guaranteed. So if your entire plan depends on an IPO happening soon, you are basically waiting on a decision that is not in your control and may not happen in the short term. That is why some investors look for private market access instead. Now, this is where things get more advanced. SpaceX shares do occasionally change hands on secondary markets. These are private transactions where early investors or employees sell a portion of their ownership to other qualified buyers. However, this is not something the average retail investor can easily participate in. Platforms that operate in this space usually require you to be an accredited investor, which typically means having a high net worth or a certain level of annual income. Even then, access is limited, deal flow is inconsistent, and minimum investments are often very high compared to regular stock trading. Now, where does Fidelity come into this picture? Fidelity itself is primarily a brokerage platform for public markets. That is what most users know it for. However, Fidelity also has divisions that work with wealth management clients, institutional investors, and private capital solutions. In some cases, high net worth clients working through Fidelity Wealth Services or affiliated advisory channels may gain exposure to private equity or venture capital funds. These funds sometimes invest in late-stage private companies, and in theory, SpaceX could be one of the holdings in certain private portfolios or institutional funds. But this is not something you can simply toggle on in a standard Fidelity brokerage account. It is not listed, it is not searchable, and it is not available as a retail product. So if someone tells you just buy SpaceX on Fidelity, that is not accurate in the direct sense. The real answer is more like this. Fidelity may be part of a broader financial ecosystem that can provide indirect exposure through managed funds, but only under specific conditions and usually through professional financial advisory channels. Now let's talk about another important angle, which is indirect investing. Even if you cannot invest directly in SpaceX, you can still position your portfolio to benefit from its growth in a more indirect way. For example, SpaceX works closely with companies in aerospace manufacturing, satellite communications, and defense technology. Some publicly traded companies are part of that broader ecosystem. By investing in those sectors, you are not buying SpaceX, but you are aligning yourself with the industries SpaceX is actively shaping. There is also the possibility that future public offerings related to SpaceX subsidiaries, partnerships, or infrastructure projects could eventually become available in the stock market. If Starlink goes public, that alone could become a major investment opportunity, and Fidelity would almost certainly provide access to it, like any other IPO. But let's come back to the main question people are actually asking. They are not just asking about logistics. They are asking how to get early exposure before everyone else does. And this is where you need to be extremely careful with expectations. Private companies like SpaceX are not designed for easy public access investing. Their valuation is determined in funding rounds, not daily trading activity. That means the price you see in headlines is often based on private deals between large investors, not something you can casually participate in. This also means liquidity is limited. Even if you somehow gain access to shares through a secondary market, you cannot always sell them freely. There are restrictions, lockup periods, and approval processes. It is not the same flexibility as buying and selling Apple stock on Fidelity within seconds. Now let's walk through what a realistic step-by-step path would look like if someone is seriously trying to pursue exposure through Fidelity and related channels. First, you would need to make sure your Fidelity account is fully set up and funded. That part is simple. You open a brokerage account, complete identity verification, link your bank, and deposit capital. This gives you access to traditional public markets immediately, but again, not SpaceX directly. Next, you would decide whether you are strictly looking for direct ownership or indirect exposure. If your goal is direct ownership, you would need to monitor SpaceX for any IPO announcement or public listing event. That is the only moment when Fidelity becomes a direct gateway to buying shares in the normal sense. If instead you were exploring advanced private market exposure, you would need to move into a different category of investing entirely. This typically involves working with wealth management services, exploring private equity funds, and potentially qualifying as an accredited investor, depending on jurisdiction and financial thresholds. At that level, Fidelity or similar institutions may provide access to curated investment products that include exposure to private companies. But again, these are not retail-friendly products, and they come with higher risk, lower liquidity, and longer investment horizons. And this is an important point that many beginners overlook. Investing in private companies is not just about access, it is about risk tolerance and time horizon. You are locking money into a company that may take years to go public, or may never go public at all. In exchange, you are betting on long-term growth at an early stage. SpaceX is often seen as one of the most attractive private companies in the world. But that does not change the fact that private investing carries uncertainty that public markets do not. So when you hear the phrase, invest in SpaceX through Fidelity, the most accurate interpretation is not a simple step-by-step purchase process. It is a spectrum of possibilities, ranging from waiting for an IPO, to indirect exposure through public markets, to highly restricted private investment channels available only to select investors. Now let's address something very important that often gets missed in conversations like this. A lot of online content makes it sound like there is a hidden trick or secret pathway to buy SpaceX shares right now as a retail investor. The reality is much more boring, but also much more honest. There is no secret button. There is no workaround inside Fidelity that suddenly unlocks SpaceX stock for everyone. What exists instead is a structured financial system with clear rules about who can invest in private companies, under what conditions, and through which intermediaries. And Fidelity operates within that system, not outside of it. So the smartest approach for most people is not to chase shortcuts, but to understand positioning. If you believe in SpaceX long term, you can still build a portfolio that benefits from the industries it is transforming. You can also stay ready for a future IPO event, which would likely be one of the most highly anticipated market entries in modern history. And when that day comes, Fidelity would become one of the simplest and most direct ways to participate. Until then, the key is understanding the difference between access and exposure. Access means owning SpaceX directly, which is currently restricted. Exposure means benefiting from the growth of related sectors and technologies, which is fully available today. So if you were expecting a simple click here and buy SpaceX on Fidelity answer, the truth is more nuanced. But that nuance is exactly what separates casual speculation from real investing knowledge. SpaceX remains private for now. Fidelity remains a gateway to public markets. And the bridge between those two worlds is either a future IPO or a limited set of private investment channels reserved for qualified investors. And that is the complete picture. If you want, I can also break down how much SpaceX would need to be worth in an IPO for it to outperform Tesla, or how early investors originally got in before it became a global giant.